Good evening. You're on the smoking section with Stephen Helfer, and I think I'm doing my, I'm into my, I guess you might say third decade of the show. I think I've done it for 20 years now, and so I'm beyond the 20-year mark, so now I'm entering to my third decade. So I welcome everybody. And I'm very appreciative of CCTV and the people who are here and who work here. And I was kind of interested because the other night I was watching something on public television about the prohibition, and it was a very interesting show done by Ken Burns. And what I kind of found interesting was he was talking about, well, first of all, at least some people on the program said prohibition, that is the prohibition of alcohol, which I don't know the years, but sometime early in the 20th century, for about 10 years, alcohol was prohibited by a constitutional amendment. It was not simply prohibited in certain states and not prohibited in other states, but it was prohibited by a constitutional amendment. And I think people thought that if they could just ban alcohol, somehow everybody's lives would improve. Of course, that's similar to the prohibitionists of tobacco, thinking that if the United States, if everybody stopped smoking, that somehow we would achieve some great improvement in health, and so that was similar that way. But one thing, I have a phone call. You're on the smoking section. One moment, please. Let me just see if I can. Oh boy. How do I can't even, they've moved this, and, oh boy. I can't figure out how to answer a phone call this evening. I haven't had one in a while. That is not good. But, let's see. Gabriella, she's not watching, I guess, and so I guess we can't do any phone calls this evening because the switch seems to have been moved from where it normally is, and that's really a shame because I was hoping that my good friend and fellow smokers' rights advocate Michael McFadden would call, but evidently that's not going to work. So one thing that the prohibitionists did is they got a lot of, I'm sorry, I can't take any phone calls, so it's no use to hang on the phone and try to get on with me tonight. But the prohibitionists got together with a lot of medical doctors who produced all kinds of so-called scientific evidence that you could have one drink and you would become addicted, or you would have one drink and you would die, or you would have one drink and you would burst into flame. So this, I didn't realize how there had been a kind of complicity on the part of the research profession at the time to produce that kind of scientific paper, or supposedly scientific paper, that would tend to further the cause. And that is something that's really happened in the world of tobacco. There is almost no disease or no condition that is not blamed on smoking, or that is not blamed on children, a mother smoking and the child grows up and gets into trouble, and people think that it's because the mother smoked. So there's There's just nothing that it can be not attributed to tobacco. And this was very much the same with alcohol in the early part of the 20th century. But eventually, so many people continued to drink that eventually the whole experiment, as it was called, was dropped. And I think and I hope that that will happen with tobacco because even though everybody thinks that right now the momentum is so much on the side of the prohibitionists, tobacco prohibitionists, only time will tell. And as I remind people, in 1990, C. Everett Koop, who was the Surgeon General at the time, and all manner of anti-smoking groups like the American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, the American Lung Association, put out a very large document called The Blueprint for Success. And their aim was to have a non-smoking America by the year 2000, and they thought it was achievable. And of course, they have made very, very big inroads. The smoking rate is much lower, and they have been able to foment a lot of stigmatization of people who smoke, and they've been able to capture what you might say is the hearts and souls of much of the population. But still, almost 40 million American people continue to smoke, and even though many of them on some level think that it's not good, I think on certain levels they know that tobacco agrees with them, and tobacco is something that not hurts them but actually enhances their lives. And the New York Times had a great quotation from a third generation tobacco farmer about 15 years ago that I like to meditate on. And that was, he said, he told the Times that tobacco is a weed, a golden weed, and weeds are hard to kill. Even weeds that have no value are hard to kill. But tobacco is something that has spread all around the world. Almost every society uses tobacco, from down in Africa to the Eskimos, and it's had an 8,000-year history here in the New World, which is South America and North America, and a very exalted history. So we will see. We will see how the game will play out. I don't know if it will play out in my lifetime, but I think there is a good chance, and I'm hoping to help it, that the anti-smoking forces will lose their momentum at some point. And it's very difficult to predict the future, and just because we have a trend in a certain direction does not mean that trend will go on forever. Although a lot of people think it will, and they like to think or predict the future, which I think is very difficult to do. Well, I'm going to go right to the Smoker of the Week today, who is also on our Facebook page, and if I can find him, I will be very happy. Oh, there we go. And we'll see what we got here. Just one moment while I get the Smoker of the Week. And here we are. And this is Dr. Paul A. Chandler. And this is from a painting. I don't know where this painting was hanging, but my good friend George Despotes took a photo of it with his cell phone, and I cropped it a bit. I think it's a nice painting. And according to the Harvard Medical School website, Dr. Chandler was the beloved mentor of generations of ophthalmologists interested in glaucoma. He completed his medical training and residency at Harvard Medical School. He established the glaucoma service at Massachusetts Eye and Ear in 1940, and there was a professorship of ophthalmology established in his honor, endowed by bequest from a patient who he treated successfully for malignant glaucoma. Dr. Chandler died in 1987 at the age of 90, and here he sits looking very comfortably and proudly with a cigarette in a cigarette holder, which you don't see very often anymore. But now the question might be, well, could Dr. Chandler have lived longer if he had not smoked? And I would say, well, maybe he would have lived shorter if he hadn't smoked. There is no evidence one way or the other that can really prove that. But I think it's very possible that Dr. Chandler was actually, that his life was enhanced by tobacco, probably helped him to work, helped him to concentrate, helped him to be easy with other people, not take things so seriously. And that's one of the things that tobacco is good for. It makes people a little less uptight, and unlike alcohol or unlike pharmaceutical drugs, tobacco does it not only without impairing one's judgment, but actually improving one's thought processes. Now, one thing I wanted to show my listeners, just a very short brief, is that I've been enjoying this pipe here, which I don't know if you can see very clearly, but it's a really nice pipe, and it comes from Levitt and Pierce. And my supervisor gave this to me upon my retirement from Harvard Law School, where I had been a library assistant for 22 years. And I don't know if people know it or not, but the modern pipe is made from briarwood, and the best briarwood in the world comes from Algeria. It's a very, very hard wood, and it really is a kind of furnace in which you burn tobacco. And a pipe is, of course, I think the oldest smoking. I'm sorry I can't take any phone calls tonight. Another phone call's coming in, but I just can't because our method for answering the phone seems to be down, as they say. And so pipe smoking, again, the earliest pipe smoking tools in the New World, or the earliest tobacco smoking tools in the New World, was the pipe. Now, last week I talked with my good friend Ken Thomas about polonium-210 and how there have been some anti-smokers who say that by tobacco smoking you are exposing yourself to unreasonable amounts of polonium-210. And Michael McFadden, again, did a very, very good rundown on why that is so misleading. And the real reason that it is misleading is for many reasons, but one reason is that polonium-210 is something that is found in the air, something that is found in the food and the water. It is I guess, a radioactive isotope, but to think that it only comes from tobacco, or to think that it comes in massive doses from tobacco, is something that anti-smokers clung onto, and were able to mislead the public because, um, as I've said before on the program, the first law, the most fundamental law of toxicology, is the dose makes the poison. So the real question is, how much more plutonium is there in tobacco, and will one get from smoking than one gets from just everyday exposure? And Michael McFadden did a very, very careful analysis of this, which I have to really look at more and better before I really get into it. So I'm going to hope to get into it next week. But one of these, this polonium-210, was brought up by a doctor at Massachusetts General Hospital, and he did a study on third-hand smoke, which got a lot of publicity and which was a real clever kind of misleading propaganda, anti-smoking propaganda. He interviewed a lot of members of the public, and he asked them whether third-hand smoke, that's the kind of smoke, that's the kind of residue from smoking or from the combustion of tobacco that will kind of settle on furniture. It's basically microscopic, but it is there. And he asked a large group of people whether they thought it was harmful and whether or not they banned smoking in their homes. And some of these people, or maybe a lot of these people, said yes, they did think third-hand smoke was harmful, and they did ban it from their homes. So that nowhere in his study did he study the effects of third-hand smoke, whether third-hand smoke was in fact harmful to anyone. But when he put this study out, it got a lot of publicity, and the third-hand smoke boogeyman entered the world, and it doesn't seem to really have gotten a lot of traction in the last 15 years, which is approximately when he started this. But his conclusion of the study, which is also not something that people read past the headline, in fact, you have to read it fairly carefully, was that health messages about third-hand smoke contamination could be easily incorporated into current tobacco control programs and routine clinical practice. So without any study of whether third-hand smoke is in fact been shown to be of any harm to anybody, he is suggesting that messages be sent out and that doctors talk about it to their patients. And lost in the whole thing, in the reporting of it, was the fact that there has never been a study that I am aware of, or certainly there wasn't at the time, that third-hand smoke could be very powerful, could have any effect on people's health. As again, Michael McFadden points out, one of the largest studies of secondhand smoke, which was done, a meta-analysis, which is really a study of other studies, which was put out by the EPA in 1992 and got a lot of attention. If you analyze the study itself shows that the exposure to secondhand smoke would have to be over hundreds of years of exposure to have any effect on people. But again, these subtleties are lost because the average person is not going to look at these things with any kind of critical eye, and is not really, the average person, or many people are very much in the thrall of the scientific profession. And if the scientific profession says something, people latch onto it and think it is gospel. One thing is, for example, a recent study, a large study on drinking, came to the conclusion that no amount of alcohol was good for you, that it's better not to drink at all. Whereas for the last 15 or 20 years, most researchers opining on the subject would say that drinking is good for people. But what most people don't realize is that these studies are all self-reporting over thousands and thousands of people with all different kinds of factors in their lives, living in all different kinds of countries with all kinds of different exposures to all kinds of different things. And they take one factor there, like see, do you drink or do you not drink? And then they compare health outcomes. But even the health outcomes vary a lot from country to country or hospital to hospital on how well it's reported, or even if it is reported, and all of those sorts of things. So these studies are all part of what's called epidemiology, which a professor at Harvard, Dr. Hennekins, once stated, again, this was about 20 years ago, is a crude and inexact science, and that that 80% of the conclusions of epidemiological studies are really hypotheses, and people, researchers, that is the scientific profession, tend to exaggerate them, either to get grant money or to get attention or to get both. So many of these studies are really, most of these epidemiological studies are very inconclusive, but they are used to great effect, and it just seems 1 week we have a study saying this, and 1 week we have a study saying that. For example, there's a fellow named Ioannidis, who is kind of a gadfly of the scientific world, and he points out that if you look at the scientific literature, almost every food that is consumed by Americans, there has been a study that will either show it can protect against cancer or it can raise the risk against cancer. So, and it's simply because by statistics, if you interview a large group of people and you say, do you eat peanut butter? Those people are probably either going to have a somewhat higher incidence of cancer than the general population, or somewhat lower. It's going to be, by the laws of probability, it's very, very unlikely that peanut butter eaters are going to have exactly the same incidence of cancer as the population as a whole, and therefore you can come out and say, get a study published and say, oh, peanut butter protects against cancer, or peanut butter raises your risks of getting cancer. And since everybody is so worried about cancer, it will get a lot of attention. And which reminds me of another book written by, again, a physician, and he calls the book Worried Sick, how people worrying so much about their health and what they eat actually make them sick, so sick rather than health. Well, next week I hope to go into that polonium-210 with greater detail, and I hope our telephone system is working. Thank you for watching.